This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more.
Hello everyone. Before Sarah starts on today's topic, I just wanted to say for me and Sarah how touched we both were during the whole week of Chelsea, because it was incredible the amount of people who came to our little stand and truly showed me and Sarah so much love and support for the podcast and our books, and we were both absolutely bowled over. It was so lovely to meet so many of you, and so we just wanted to say thank you, because it really was truly touching.
Yeah, it really was. I had a meeting with Jemima yesterday and we were having a bit of a sort of roundup, wash up about Chelsea. And what I said to her is that I just enjoyed every single minute of it, even when it was pouring with rain and I was freezing and I was soaked down to my knickers. It was just so lovely to meet so many people and customers who buy from our online nursery, you know, giving us feedback about the packaging and their plants and their slugs and their snails and their problems and their successes. And it was just so completely lovely. We came away from that week, all of us, on a complete high, and we will definitely be back next year. So hope to see you next May. But anyway, just to back up what Arthur said, thank you so much to all of you for coming to join us and for chatting. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and a roving crew of different guests. But today we've got me on my own. And the reason is that we had really lovely positive feedback about the cooking one that I did. So harvesting from the garden and cooking and giving you some of my favourite recipes. And I guess the podcast is called Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange. And I feel perhaps we need to shift our emphasis a bit more towards the eating side as well as the growing side. So I thought I would chat through. Last time I did 6 favourite vegetables for a bit earlier in the year. And I thought I would try and do the same, vegetables and herbs. And so this morning I got up really early and I walked around the garden, and I actually have some great friends' 60th birthdays this weekend here. And I was thinking, what was I going to cook for them? And it's from the garden in sort of early mid-June, depending on where you live. I mean, so I just was looking at exactly what was looking wonderful and I know is going to taste wonderful, picked from just outside and brought into the kitchen. So, number 1, globe artichokes. Now, they are perfect fare for an allotment because they are very low maintenance. They're Mediterranean, so they're very drought tolerant. They're actually very tolerant of quite a windy site too, and so they don't need sort of tons of mollycoddling. They are said not to be hardy, but I've had them growing in the garden here now for 28, 29 years, so they seem to be hardy here anyway. And they just look great, don't they? So they're one of the first foliages, along with alliums, to emerge in February. And sometimes in a mild winter, they don't die back at all. So I find I turn to the foliage and use it to arrange with hellebores really, really often in February, March and April. And then what happens is that the leaves bulk up and then you get these wonderful, they're of course the flower buds is what is the globe artichoke. And they're just really plumping up right now and growing to a good size. And they're a funny thing because a lot of people will tell you to grow them from seed. And it's true, you can, and they're really easy to germinate. And if you want them as an ornamental, that's a very, very fine way to do it. But what I find is grown from seed, you get a little bit of a mix of things that are more like a cardoon, which grows taller and has very spiny flowers and doesn't have that lovely plump base to the leaf scale, which is what you eat with a globe artichoke, or not as much anyway, not the volume. And you get some like that, some halfway between, and some perfect sort of green footballs, which are lush. So I think much, much better, if possible, is to propagate from a friend's. So if you know anyone who's got a good plump round globe artichoke with a good volume of the green stuff at the bottom of the leaf scale, then just beg a little offset from them. And you don't even need to dig up the mother plant. You can just get a sharp spade and literally just cut from the outside, just one section of the mother plant, pot it up into a rich mix of compost and grow it on. Cut the leaves back once you've taken it off the mother plant, cut the leaves off, pot it up in a good sized pot because they're quite chunky root systems. And then once the leaves have grown back in 4 to 6 weeks, plant them out in the garden. And if possible, don't eat from them for the first year, but you can start harvesting them. I mean, ideally not for the next year, but the year after. But if you're greedy like me, you might want to get in there quicker. But you just have to be a little bit careful, like with rhubarb, that you don't exhaust the rootstock, and so you let it get established before you start harvesting from it. Anyway, globe artichokes, wonderful, wonderful things. How to cook them? Well, how I do them is I get the biggest pan I've got in the house, fill it with water, and if I'm doing like 10 or 12, like I'm going to be doing on Friday, I would do them in 2 pans. I wouldn't try and get them all in at once because they're quite dense. And what you'll find is that the heat doesn't permeate from the bottom of the pan if you put too many in to the top. So the ones at the top actually take 15 to 20 minutes cooking time longer than the ones at the bottom, which are falling apart and mushy. So put 3 or 4, maybe 5 to a big pan, and then put a saucepan lid, which is smaller than the saucepan you're using, and that holds them down into the water. Otherwise, they bob up like bobbing apples at a Halloween party. And then put a lid on and just put them on a gentle simmer. Lots of salty water to cook them, and they take, depending on size, between 30 and 40 minutes per artichoke. But you'll know that they're cooked because you'll walk into the room and the whole room will have this sweet, slightly strange, absolutely characteristic artichoke smell. And as soon as they start to smell, it's a good indication that they're cooked or almost cooked. So I then go to them and carefully, not burning myself, get one into a spoon, and then I'll pull the outer leaf scale off it and between my thumb and forefinger. And if it comes off easily from the heart, you know that it's cooked. And you don't want it to completely disintegrate. So it's just getting that timing right. And as I say, depending on size, it's 30 to 40 minutes. And then I let them cool. Now, you can either serve them with a straightforward French dressing, and in France, they quite often do a really rich Dijon dressing. But my favourite recipe in the whole of the garden cookbook is globe artichokes with Angelica sauce. And that is a sauce made from a few hard-boiled eggs. Now, obviously, this will vary hugely as to how many people you're cooking for. But if you've got, let's say, sort of 4 to 6 artichokes, I would use 4 eggs, and you hard boil those and shell them. And then you want a whopping bunch that will literally fill your fist. The stems will fill your fist. Predominantly parsley, and ideally it's flat leaf parsley. So that should be about 50%. But then the other 50% made up for whatever you've got in the garden. So maybe a little bit of chives, a little bit of fennel, a little bit of dill, perhaps some coriander, perhaps even some French tarragon. So you can just have a real old mix-up to give you the tangy flavours. And then I use 2 of those very narrow tins of anchovy fillets, and I just chop them up roughly. And then you need really good extra virgin olive oil, and about 300 mils is what I would use for that quantity of eggs and herbs, and 3 tablespoons of red wine vinegar. And you don't need salt, of course, because you've got the anchovy fillets. And then I would literally, with a sharp knife, I would chop up the hard-boiled eggs. And I wouldn't do this in a food processor if possible, because it purees it too much. You want a coarse texture. So in go the hard-boiled eggs, in go the herbs. You can put some olives in, you can put some capers in. Quite often my sister puts those in, and that's a lovely addition. Sometimes do, sometimes don't if I don't have them. And then you pour over the olive oil, the vinegar. You could use lemon juice. You don't need salt and pepper, and you just mix it all together. And it's this really chunky, coarse salsa verde, but with hard-boiled eggs. And it's substantial and really filling. And it was one of the dishes that I was taught, very simple dish, but by a fantastic elderly chef who was a cook in a house my parents used to rent when I was very young, sort of 6, 7, 8, and she got me into cooking. And so it's actually in, was put it in the podcast notes, but it's in Garden Cookbook, which I know lots of you have, called Globe Artichokes with Angelica sauce. Anyway, it's fantastic. So globe artichokes are the first. The second thing is, of course, right now, broad beans. And broad beans, you want to pinch out the tips as soon as you see the first bean forming at the base of the plant. And I'm sorry, you might hear me ruffling through a little bit because I'm trying to find the recipes in the Garden Cookbook, just so I give you the right sort of quantities. Now, there are so many different things that you can do with broad beans, but I actually rather love them in a parsley sauce. And so I would pick them, and it actually doesn't matter if they're quite big and starchy for this recipe. And then I just make a bechamel sauce and a little bit of nutmeg and then tons and tons of parsley. And that is so delicious because the sort of carbohydratey, creamy texture of the broad bean couldn't be nicer, with the sort of, again, the sort of creaminess of the bechamel, but also with the sort of slightly tangy but mellow, grassy flavour of parsley. So that's one of my favourite things. And another thing I love to serve as part of a buffet is broad beans in a tapenade. So I would just coarsely chop up some black olives, perhaps again put some anchovies in there, perhaps some capers and some herbs, and then just toss it in an olive oily mix, and then just put your just boiled beans into that sort of black, unctuous, very rich mix of flavours. And again, because broad beans are quite robust in texture and flavour, they can really carry the olive tapenade incredibly well. So that's another really lovely thing. And don't forget, with broad beans, you can eat the flowers too. That will mean you don't get beans, of course, but with the crimson flowered broad bean, which I grow ornamentally here in the borders, I actually quite often pick a few of the beautiful crimson flowers to put over a salad, and they taste deliciously of broad beans. And I love them. So that's number 2, and perhaps even really kind of number 3, because flat leaf parsley is something that I sow twice a year. You can sow it now again to take you right the way through into the winter. It's the most wonderful, wonderful herb. Even if you don't have a garden, you can grow it in a window box. We have it in window boxes here, all down the edges of paths because we pick so much of it. And the one thing you need to know is wash the seed, just soak the seed overnight, dry them on kitchen paper or a bit of blue roll or whatever, and then sow them, because that washes the germinator inhibitor off the seed coat. But I've talked about that in other episodes, so I'm not going to bang on about that again. So maybe that's sort of 1, 2, and 3. The other thing, number 4, that is looking really good, surprisingly actually, for the month of June, is my wild rocket. Now, the thing about wild rocket is that it's from Turkey, and it is heat tolerant and drought tolerant. And it doesn't get flea beetle, which is the little tiny beetle that hops like a flea and peppers rocket leaves with lots of tiny little holes, so much so that they can end up looking like lace, and you really feel you don't want to eat them. But wild rocket does not get that as severely as salad rocket. Salad rocket is a wild plant, like wild rocket, but not of the Mediterranean, but of Asia, and it grows in the mountains in Japan and China. It's very hardy, but it does get flea beetle. And what I find is I tend to pick salad rocket between sort of September or August and April, and I then move to wild rocket between April and August or September because of its drought-tolerant nature. And it's looking really fantastic. So I'm definitely going to serve a salad this weekend with the first of our beetroots, and I'll boil them whole, skin on, just take the leaves off, plop them into salted water, and they're nice and young and juicy at the moment. And then I'll cool them, do a bed of the wild rocket, washed carefully so there are no flea beetles in there, and then cool the beetroot, chop it up coarsely, put it over my plate of wild rocket. I'm then got some marinated feta in the fridge, and I always buy a big block of feta, and I put it straight away in jam jars with olive oil, a few chili flakes, and some lemon zest, and perhaps some thyme, or winter savoury or summer savoury or whatever, and I marinate it. So I'll get that out, crumble that over the beetroot, and then put lots of mint leaves for sharpness, and then I'll make a dressing with perhaps some of the olive oil from the feta jar, if I've used the whole jar. If not, some extra virgin olive oil, lemon juice, a little bit of salt, but not too much because of the feta, and black pepper. So that is such an easy and delicious summer salad, and it's when your rocket is its most prolific. So that's 4. And then 5 and 6, I'm actually going to finish with a couple of lesser known herbs. And I did toy with French tarragon, which I do love. But do you know what? In June, it's not fully grown yet this year because it's been such a late year. So I thought I would skip over tarragon and come back to that next month or the month after. So I've actually chosen 2 other herbs that are looking really splendid at the moment. And one is Lovage and the other is Sorrel. So let's start with Sorrel. Sorrel, you could go out into a meadow by you. And of course, all the normal rules about foraging, you've got to ask the landlord and but you can just pick it from the fields, and it has dock-like looking leaves. Sorry, not leaves, flowers, red, like docks. And at the base, you'll find lovely, bright green leaves. And if you taste them, you'll know it isn't a dock, but it's sorrel because they're very lemony. Anyway, I actually grow that in the garden because I love it so much, and I harvest it very hard. So I'll cut it to the ground, literally to the ground once a fortnight, water it, and then you get fresh leaves back again. And they have much more taste and a more tender texture if you treat them like that. Anyway, what to do with sorrel? Fabulous in a salad. But you need to remove the green from the midrib, the vein, because that's a bit coarser in texture and a bit stringy. Or one of my favourite ever recipes for fish or chicken is a Jane Grigston recipe, I think for turbot, but you can use any whole fish, and just put them in a very hot oven with a little bit of white wine, ideally, could be lemon juice, but white wine ideally. Once the fish is cooked, and I always tell how a whole fish is cooked by putting a sharp knife into the center, the thickest part of the fish, and just touch it to my lip. And if it's warm to your lip, you will know that it's cooked right to the heart of the fish. Take it out, let it cool a bit, and then take all the juices, the fish juices, which has got, of course, the white wine and perhaps some herbs in it too, like fennel, put in the fish cavity. Let that cool, and then put that on a pan with double cream. Could be creme fraiche, but double cream, and just bring it up to sort of blood temperature and pile in lots and lots of sorrel. And then take it off the heat immediately and whisk it. So the sorrel needs to be quite finely chopped. And that gives you the most delicious fish or chicken sauce. I couldn't more recommend it. It's lemony, but crossed with sort of spinachy, and it's just wonderful. But you mustn't cook the sorrel because it goes a rather nasty sort of cowpat brown. So you want to keep the freshness, and that's what I mean about taking it off the heat. And then you could whisk it in a food processor quickly, but you don't really need to. And that is sensational. And the last recipe and last plant for this episode is Lovage. It's really popular in Hungarian cooking, as I'm sure you know, and also Ukrainian cooking. The lovely chef Olya Hercules, who is Ukrainian, who has the most wonderful Instagram and has fantastic recipes on that. She uses Lovage quite a bit. And I use it at this time of the year before it comes up to flower in 2 ways. One, I pick the baby heart leaves and I chop them coarsely and put them in a French dressing and then scatter them over a lettuce salad. And it's really amazing. It's a cross in flavour between sort of celery and parsley, but it's got a smokiness to it. And I absolutely love it in a dressing. And the second way I use it is in a soup. And I'm just going to give you a recipe for a soup that I've been making a lot recently, which is actually based on a pea and mint soup recipe that a friend of mine gave me. And it's 800 grams of onion, finely chopped. It melted down in 30 grams of butter and a little splash of olive oil. And then 500 grams of frozen peas. So that's a whole bag. And this is for sort of 3 to 4 of you, or perhaps less if you're having it as a main course. And then 500 mils of vegetable stock. And then you can either do it with mint, and you want a good handful of mint leaves, which have been stripped off the stem, obviously, or I've been making it just in the last couple of weeks with the same weight, which is about 10 grams of Lovage leaves. And the smaller ones, ideally, again, salt and pepper, and I just whiz it up together, and that is lunch with a bit of sourdough. Yes, please. Absolutely delicious. Lovage is incredibly easy to grow, and it's ornamental enough to put in a herbaceous border. And you can just harvest the leaves, but then you can enjoy the flowers, which are umbels. So they're sort of umbellifers, like, the things like angelica, etc. Anyway, so there we are. Globe artichokes, broad beans, parsley, rocket with beetroot, sorrel and lovage. And those are my top tips for June garden cooking. Thanks so much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange with me, Sarah Raven. And next week, actually, we're sticking with veg, and I'm joined by Jess Goff, who is a young woman growing veg in the Somerset Levels. She has an amazing Instagram account, which is how I came across her, called The Small Holding. And she's just a really brilliant communicator and teacher, and kind of, in a way, is sort of what I hoped I was 30 years ago. And I just think she'll be really lovely to chat to. So join us then.
You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.